At long last, Camilla has left the palace. The truth has been verified by Prince William after weeks of conjecture. Camilla is no longer at the palace. In his address to the nation, he spoke with a deep and passionate tone, shocking many. A tragic truth that few anticipated has emerged from what was once a quiet royal rift. Why did she truly decide to leave? Will the royal family ever be able to move past this? We will reveal the information, so stay tuned. An unwelcome queen's quiet. They had always despised her. The rumors had trailed Camilla Parker BS through all of the regal halls like a shadow ever since she became queen consort. This was still fresh in people's minds. They thought of Diana, beautiful and broken Diana, and who had filled her shoes. Time could not erase the fact that she was the other woman who sported a crown. Unannounced and gloomy like sour tea, the dawn came. Camilla awoke in Clarence's house to an eerily quiet room, as if the walls themselves had been given a special order not to utter a word. Upon rising and making her way across the house, her footsteps resounded excessively. Staff activity was noticeably low. No one in the hallway looked her in the eyes. On the breakfast table, the morning papers lay folded, but her assistant had turned them face down. Like a thorn in her flesh, another minor anomaly pricked at her awareness. Camilla discovered her schedule had been changed by mid-morning. The trip to the pediatric hospital came to an end. The patronage committee meal has been rescheduled forever. The press office secretary gave her a string of meaningless excuses when she called. Problems with technology, issues with appointment times. The words were as polished and practiced as elevator music, yet they had no real meaning. There was a commotion, information that nobody wanted to share with her. Gradually, the insight dawned, feeling the chill of a long winter in your bones. Memories of the meeting 3 days prior flooded her mind, same one that had made her feel oddly empty. In order to finalize plans for the forthcoming celebration of his grandmother's legacy, Prince William had asked for her attendance at Kensington Palace. Dates, flowers, and courteous planning should have been the easy part. However, William had changed that day. He remained perfectly polite and correctly addressed her by her title. Still, his blue eyes had a frozen quality to them. During her suggestion to include specific relatives in the ceremony, he interrupted her. "I believe it is crucial that we exercise extreme caution when communicating," he had previously stated, his voice low but razor-sharp. "The people have high hopes for the monarchy and the people's representatives from this family." With a nod and a smile, she consented to reevaluate. Still, the words had lingered, revolving in her thoughts like indestructible stones. Why had he said that? To whom was he referring? After undergoing surgery, King Charles had been resting. According to the doctors, it's nothing serious. Rest and privacy were just required for everyday treatment. The family dynamic, however, had changed like the wind patterns before a storm while he was away. Upon her entrance inside the rooms, all conversation ceased. Gatherings took place in her absence. It seemed like all of a sudden, the tenderness that had developed between her and the younger royals had vanished. At that point in the afternoon, Camilla felt as if she were a ghost in her own existence, aimlessly walking the home. On her way out of the study, she went past a group of employees. Their expressions were deliberately expressionless as they froze upon seeing her, but she had heard everything. Something is being prepared at William's office, regarding public trust and contemporary ideals. One of them had been making a remark regarding the monarchy's future. The words had a chilling effect on her. Her hands started to shake, but she kept walking and kept her face calm. Camilla gave herself permission to remember that night as she sat alone in her living room and the rain started tapping against the windows. She reflected on the first several years of her marriage to Charles, when she felt like she was walking through fire at every public appearance. Protesters held up placards and media commentators picked apart her every move and outfit choice, constantly reminding the public that she wasn't and would never be Diana. Everything had been through her. In order to avoid the limelight, she had worked covertly, accepted patronages that no one else was interested in, and made charitable and hospital visits. Even though she knew it might never be hers, she had worked to earn it nevertheless. A simple recognition of her right to live the life she had chosen, acceptance and respect, had all been in vain. The question weighed heavily on her heart. She had worked so hard to go from the story's antagonist into a character who could proudly stand by Charles's side. Maybe naively, she had thought that, with the passage of time, people would see past her previous mistakes and recognize her for who she really is. Maybe I was naive, though. Maybe no amount of time or effort could ever make up for some transgressions. A tidy stack of the day's correspondence lay on the little table next to her chair, and her gaze wandered there. She had been dodging the package all afternoon, and it rested on top. Lightweight cream paper. A golden crest appears imprinted on it. a dark blue wax stamp with Prince William's personal imprint. For a long time, she stared at it, frightened to touch it since she had seen that precise, controlled handwriting on official documents and Christmas cards, and she wondered what words might be waiting inside. He clearly doesn't have anything important to convey to her in writing. Is there any message that is so crucial or challenging that it cannot be conveyed in person? As the rain intensified outside, it beat impatiently against the glass. As night fell, the room became increasingly dim, but Camilla remained motionless, refusing to switch on the lights. As night fell, she sat in the waning light, the weight of her position pressing down on her shoulders, the unread letter resting beside her. Her official title was Queen Consort of Britain. At the king's side she sat. The crown and the title were bestowed upon her. At this very second, though, she felt like an unwelcome guest in this frigid and deserted home, ready to be shown the door. As the sun set, Camilla pondered whether she desired to know the contents of the sealed letter, or if the possibility of remaining in the dark represented the final mercy that might be bestowed upon her. Choice made by the heir. William was the soft-spoken one from the start. His reserved demeanor distinguished him from other boys his age, even when he was a little youngster. William, in contrast to his curious and mischievous brother, looked about with wise eyes that belied his youth. One thing his grandma stated about him was that he had a gentle soul, maybe even too gentle for the world that lay ahead. As she had cautioned, though, kings could rarely afford to be benevolent. William finally grasped her meaning as he strolled alone through Windsor's grounds on a cool autumn afternoon. Today, he felt as if the air, his ideas, and the future were all physically burdening him. Refused to let go of. The ancient rose garden, which his mother had cherished, beckoned to him. When he was little, Diana would take him here, and, with that sweet voice that could turn any ordinary afternoon into a fairy tale, she would identify the flowers and show him where they were. As she leaned her head toward the sun and closed her eyes on the stone bench under the oak tree, she appeared serene, even joyful, for those few moments. Standing where she had sat, William gazed at the prickly branches that will bear flowers again in the spring. Everything that had transpired thereafter had altered the garden's vibe. A marriage that ought to have been idyllic comes crashing down due to secrets, betrayals, and the agonizing dissolution of the union. This formerly tranquil spot now spoke of unfulfilled vows and long-simmering pain. With his eyes closed, he attempted to conjure up the sound of his mother's laughter, but the sound of the wind overwhelmed him. The urgency of the meeting that afternoon had made it brutal. Sitting across from him in a wood-paneled chamber that smelled of old books and furniture polish were three senior advisors, men whose careers were devoted to safeguarding the institution of monarchy. Spreadsheets, polling data, and media cuttings with increasingly antagonistic headlines were at their disposal. According to the oldest advisor, who spoke in a measured and cautious manner, popular opinion toward the Queen Consort has changed. She has rekindled old scars with her recent actions about specific patronages and the anniversary coverage of the late princess. Her authority and judgment are being called into doubt by the commenters. Still another had knelt down and rested his fists on the dark wood table. I assure you, Your Royal Highness, that our suggestions are not long-term. It is only a short break from public service, taking a smart backward step while we calm down and keep the story on track. William remained silent and merely listened as they presented their argument using data, statistics, and calculating political calculations. They treated a woman's place in the family as if it were a quarterly profit report, talking about things like public trust and approval ratings. They had stared at the future king with anticipation as they finished, waiting for him to make the brutal decision that duty demanded. However, William's nausea was solely a result of his recollection of earlier events, which were more difficult to square with the medical evaluation he had just received. At 13 years old, he was still reeling from the loss of his mother. Camilla had left him a book on astronomy and constellations that he had previously professed to love, and he had forgotten about it. She hadn't made a big deal out of it or asked for thanks. In her clumsy, insecure manner, she had merely observed and cared. During one of Harry's lowest points, he recalled her sitting quietly with him and offering nothing more than her presence. Whenever his father was embarrassed in public, he could feel her steady hand resting on his back. How she patiently took criticism so that Charles could get his job done. She has her flaws. She was responsible for his mother's unimaginable suffering because of her dreadful blunders. William had always remembered that. Nothing about it will ever slip my mind. The idea of ignoring her was like reliving the decades-long cycle of abuse that had afflicted his family. She was human, imperfect, and trying. But the crown insisted on decisions that were too big for sentimental safeguards. William had known this ever since he was of legal age to comprehend the significance of his birthright. He paid a visit to his dad that night. Charles appeared frilier and smaller than William wished to admit as he lay propped up on pillows in his private chamber. William felt an uncontrollable flutter of worry when he beheld the king in this state, pallid and exhausted under the lamplight, despite the fact that the king's illness had been characterized as minor and manageable. They had a little conversation about nothing much, the weather, Christmas plans, and Charles's expected recuperation time. But just as William was ready to depart, his father reached out and grabbed his wrist. The hold was tentative, yet tenacious. "William, please, whatever you're planning, don't break us again," Charles pleaded, his eyes searching his face with a desperate sense of desperation. "We've had enough of this vacation." William had nodded, given his father a gentle squeeze, and then walked away without promising anything he wasn't certain he could maintain. Late into the night, he sat alone at his desk, lit only by a solitary lamp that projected shadows across the page in front of him. Hours had passed while penning the message, word per word, selected with care. He was ill-equipped to foresee the potential outcomes of each sentence. After many drafts, revisions, tears, and starts, he finally gave up attempting to find the right words to express the delicate balance between duty and compassion, strength and mercy. That didn't happen. With a tiny quiver in his palm, William read the declaration one last time. A new course of action for the monarchy was laid out in the remarks, one that would essentially remove Camilla from important public obligations by rearranging her duties. Although the tone was diplomatic, moderate, and polite, the message was clear. Someone was putting her aside. All the things his mother had gone through and lost came to him as he reflected on his own life. He pondered the future of his children and the monarchy they would inherit, wondering if it would endure without him making these tough decisions now. He recalled the terror that had once been in his father's begging eyes. He pondered the possibility of Camilla reading this remark tomorrow morning, coming to terms with the fact that the family she had battled so hard to be a part of was making her feel invisible once again. William felt a knot in his throat from feelings he couldn't put into words as he held the envelope in his palm. There was a prepared seal. Everything would alter with just a single press and a single instant of dedication. Leaves were still being tossed about by the wind on the foreboding grounds outside his window. People slept in the palace, oblivious to the fact that tomorrow will change their world. After taking a long breath, William firmly pressed the seal down and observed as the wax solidified into permanence. Decisions were taken. That was it. But in the stillness of his study, he couldn't escape the unsettling thought that he had shattered something priceless, perhaps irreparable. Plus, he had no idea if he had preserved the crown or severed the only link in his broken family. A letter and a tempest. Charles was a man who felt things, as contrast to others who viewed merely formalities and obligations. Through the ancient trees, he heard music on the wind and saw gardens drenched in rain. He thought his plants would listen if he spoke to them. The beauty he saw in the Scottish Highlands compelled him to paint them in watercolor before it disappeared. Now, perched by the lofty windows of Balmoral on a rainy morning, King Charles III perused the newspapers laid out before him, his carefully maintained composure starting to crumble. In recent weeks, his health had taken a dramatic turn for the better. His doctors spoke in hopeful tones about his healing and vigor returning, expressing their pleasure with his improvement. His body was reacting normally to the treatment and was beginning to mend. Despite this, his heart felt weaker than it ever had before, and no amount of medication could alleviate the pain that was raging within his chest. As usual, the papers were rife with speculation. Today, though, the rumors were backed by evidence. Unnamed sources within the palace have hinted at upcoming changes within the royal family, as well as discussions of modernization, restructuring, and the need to make painful decisions for the benefit of the monarchy. They could have avoided saying Camilla's name altogether. Every delicately crafted line might be deciphered by Charles. Their leader was his son, and they were on their way to get her. Underneath a pile of correspondence on his desk, an envelope with William's seal lay. It was hand-delivered that morning by courier with the pomp and circumstance befitting its significance. After briefly glancing at it, Charles had recognized the handwriting and averted his gaze. He refrained from opening it, for doing so would render the words within tangible, compelling him to determine his true character as a monarch and parent. Whatever the case may be, he was already aware of the rumors. A statement about the future of the monarchy was being prepared by the Prince of Wales, according to his private secretary, who had mentioned with the usual delicateness that certain changes were being considered and that the Queen Consort's public role could be rethought in view of public opinion and future plans. Presented in a new light, they were expressing something completely nonviolent. The removal of Camilla was their desired outcome. After closing his eyes, Charles allowed the flood of memories to overflow him. He recalled the long struggle to include her in the royal family, the never-ending struggle against societal norms and condemnation from loved ones. Those one-on-one sessions with his mom, during which she had made her disapproval quite obvious, attempting to legitimize a love that the world had rejected through discussions, compromises, and a long, painful process. As he stood by Camilla's side at their wedding, he recalled the demonstrators outside, the cries of anguish and treachery, and his refusal to let the animosity triumph. Subtly, he had assured her that he would shield her from harm and ensure that she would never again be exposed to such brutality on her own. He had fulfilled this vow. He had protected her reputation from every slur, insult, and cruel article for years. He had poured his heart and soul into proving her identity to the world. She was not the culprit from a bygone scandal, but rather an accomplished woman who had deserved to be by his side. He was adamant that she be named Queen Consort upon becoming king, rather than some demeaning title that would imply she would always be second in line. His son now sought to reverse what had been his triumph and justification. Charles stood up from his seat and walked over to the phone, his hand quivering slightly as he took up the handset. In his desperate search for reassurance that they could endure this storm, and all the others like it, he dialed Camilla's secret number. It rang and rang. After getting no response, he approached her lady-in-waiting, who delicately told him that Her Majesty had left for Windsor earlier in the morning. A last-minute excursion planned in a flash. No message has been left by her. Slowly, as knowledge rushed over him like cold water, Charles set the receiver down. That much was known to Camilla. She had listened to the rumblings, known what was coming, and still she had departed without bidding farewell. Maybe seeing the decision he would have to make was too much for her to handle. Maybe she was letting him know that it was okay to prioritize duty before love, something she had anticipated all along. He made his way through his study, a space brimming with priceless artifacts amassed over the years. The walls were adorned with portraits of his family, his parents, his children, and his grandchildren. Those precious moments frozen in time, caught in silver frames, seemed so far away now. One showed young William, embraced by Diana's arm around his shoulders, smiling broadly for the camera. Yet another one of Harry giggling over an old joke. A more recent one of Charles and Camilla together in the garden, gazing joyfully into the sunlight, the two of them. Since when does love have to endure such anguish because of duty? When did obtaining the crown become so important that it required giving up all individual happiness? All his life, Charles had studied history and tradition in preparation for his role as king, and he had felt the burden of obligation. Although he had a son and a wife, no one had ever shown him how to pick one over the other. Nobody had forewarned him of this specific anguish. He reflected on his mother, Elizabeth, who had devotedly held the throne for 7 decades. Time and again, she had taken the unthinkable decision to put her responsibilities ahead of her own desires. Being a monarch meant belonging not to oneself, but to one's nation, and she had grasped this more clearly than anybody else. You did not truly own your life. There was someone else's heart in you. Charles had always been in awe of that power. He questioned whether that kind of power was really a synonym for brutality, as he was now confronted with an impossible decision of his own. When it was not in use, it was stored upstairs in the old wooden chest. Crowned with jewels, it was a hefty emblem of his metamorphosis. As he reflected on the coronation, Charles remembered the weight of the crown and how it had felt at once familiar and strange, like donning the very fabric of history. Power and consistency were to be symbolized by it. The uninterrupted succession of kings and queens spanning generations. Love was a sign of weakness and loyalty was a price to pay, but just now it seemed like it belonged to someone else, to a future he hardly grasped, to a form of kingship he had never wanted but couldn't resist. Dark and foreboding thunder rumbled off in the distance. Dark clouds were forming over the hills, so Charles went back to the window to observe. A tempest was on its way, churning unstoppably across the highlands of Scotland. The natural world seems to be reflecting the internal upheaval of these old fortifications. The impending confrontation that will soon rip apart the painstakingly constructed item they had all labored over. With a heavy heart, he took William's letter and held it in his hands. His son's writing on the envelope was so sure and plain, like that of a guy whose goal was crystal obvious and who would not be influenced. At that moment, Charles's loss became crystal clear. Without his input, the choice had been taken. Now that the future had come, the past he had battled so hard to erase could no longer be a part of it. The rain started to pour, gently at first, and then more forcefully, striking the windows like restless fingers beckoning for admission. Charles stood in his study, encircled by choices and memories, and burdened by the crushing weight of an ever heavier crown. Thunder and rain were the only sounds that shattered the stillness. The air was thick with an unanswered question. How can a people maintain faith in its monarch when his heart fractures into inconsolable fragments? Or does it all fall apart, exposing an elderly guy who loved too much and didn't protect himself enough? When the statement is made, the palace bore witness, silently through the ages, to the crown's every delight and sorrow. It had beheld infants' tentative steps on marble floors that had previously been traversed by monarchs. It had soaked up the joyous revelry and the somber lamentation of individual tragedies. Its walls were a safe haven for priceless mementos, love letters stashed in drawers, hushed disagreements discussed behind closed doors, and embarrassing events that history would never document. The palace could feel the weight building like storm clouds at every corner as dawn reluctantly broke gray over London on this particular morning. Even before the sun came up, there was a steady rain that made the stones in the courtyard slippery and black. The footmen's extraordinary silence resounded as they made their way down the halls, their shiny shoes scarcely scraping the flooring they'd traveled 1,000 times before. They looked at each other and said nothing, as if speaking would confirm what they could all feel was coming. Everyone in the kitchen ate their meal mechanically, although none seemed hungry. While placing pastries on silver platters, the chef observed that his assistant's hands were trembling. Deep within the palace, something gigantic was rumbling, and the whole place was electric with the sensation. Press officers congregated in a small room in the east wing, where the aroma of coffee and nervous energy wafted through the air. They clung to tablets and folders as they checked and double-checked statements that had been drafted, revised, and reviewed by advisors and attorneys all night long. Their sleep deprivation showed in their drawn features and red eyes. The smallest one of them appeared to be contemplating a possible escape by constantly looking toward the window. Perched atop the table, the senior press secretary's lips formed a thin line, as if she were fully aware of the events that were about to transpire, and drew a blank about each one. As the rain continued to fall, journalists began to congregate outside the elaborate gates that had protected kings and queens for centuries. With their cameras covered with plastic, they waited patiently under awnings and umbrellas, as if they knew a story was about to come. Iron and gold, the gate stood motionless against the dreary morning, retaining the world at arm's length for the time being. However, the palace had transformed into a platform for whispering on the inside. Waiting at the doorways, the maids listened. Calls were made by secretaries in a low voice. With nuanced nods and meaningful glances, security personnel communicated. Two senior advisors hurried past with glum expressions, and the maintenance worker who was adjusting a lamp in the great corridor ceased his job immediately. It seemed as if the kings and queens shown in the image were looking down on the upcoming terrible chapter in history with eyes that knew all too well. In the briefing room, where regular announcements regarding garden parties and state visits are typically made, as Prince William stood by, a royal attendant anxiously fiddled with the microphone stand. The prince's outfit was as impeccable as ever, and his tie was absolutely straight, but there was an obvious sign of exhaustion in his eyes. Underneath the black dots was skin. Muscles in his jaw were clenching as if he were trying to chew words he couldn't utter. He seemed like a man who hadn't gotten any rest and had taken a decision that would follow him about like a shadow, regardless of how right it was. The assistant murmured something. William hardly moved his head as he nodded once. As if oblivious to their presence, he studied the documents resting in his hands. The cameras went live at exactly 9 o'clock. A flash of red light turned them on. In a calm and collected manner, the royal assistant was the first to stand up and announce that the Prince of Wales had some words to say on the future of royal responsibilities. Upon William's arrival at the podium, the chamber descended into an eerie stillness, with the sound of rain on the windows mimicking the sound of applause. His expressionless voice matched his expressionless visage as he read aloud. The statement was succinct and polite, conveying appreciation and respect. In it, the Queen Consort's selfless dedication over many years was noted. It recognized the difficulties of public life and the burdens carried by those who serve the king. Afterwards, it revealed, in a devastatingly straightforward manner, that Camilla would be taking a break from her royal duties for the time being to concentrate on herself, reflect, and heal. Like fog, the phrase, personal reflection, floated across the atmosphere. It was clear to everyone what they meant. There was no respite here. This was here to stay. The expulsion attempted to maintain dignity while conveying rejection. The exile wore diplomatic attire. Williams clenched the podium's edges, his knuckles contrasting with the dark wood. After completing his reading, he glanced up, locking eyes with the camera for an instant before resuming his position. Everything was visible to the palace in that first glance. Anguish, resolve, and the terrifying confidence of a man who thought he had made the sole viable option, even as it tore him apart on the inside. We broke off the briefing. For what seemed like an eternity, nobody moved, and the cameras were off. Then, softly at first, the noise started. A senior housekeeper knelt in the corner, her shoulders trembling from silent sobbing, and covered her face with a cloth. After 30 years of service, one of the family's footmen lowered his head and placed his hand on his chest. While some people tried to make sense of what they had seen, others merely gazed at the ground or the walls. With his aides unable to keep up with his rapid speed, William departed through an alternate entrance. Neither did he pause to look around. As they watched him leave, the palace felt a deep pain, like a wound opening. Managed anarchy broke out in the press office. The phone started ringing right away. From outside the gates, reporters were already yelling questions. Major news organizations received prepared responses as assistants hurriedly sent them. Wondering how long they could possibly contain what had just been released, the senior press secretary stood at the window and watched the rain pour harder now. Away from the prying eyes and mayhem, Camilla sat in a window seat in her own rooms in a different area of London, listening to a gentle radio station on the table next to her. This moment had been looming on her mind. The chill of winter was building, and I could feel it coming. Nevertheless, the sentences became more tangible than they would have been without William's authoritative delivery. With a tiny quiver in her voice, she placed her hands in her lap. A plain dress and a cardigan were her only defenses against the coolness that appeared to originate from within rather than the room. She dispensed with jewelry and formal attire. It was as if the announcement had literally shrunk her, making her appear smaller. She remained still throughout the entire statement. The experts had already analyzed what it signified, her future plans, and the implications for the monarchy's future while I listened to their analysis. She persisted in her listening till the rain turned into a heavy downpour and her tea turned cold. She then muttered 2 words into the vacant chamber, her voice barely audible beyond the walls. Here it is. Instead of crying, she remained composed. Maybe she had dried up her eyes. Maybe she had anticipated the story's conclusion the whole time. The one whose heart belonged to a royal. The woman who had battled for acceptance for decades. The powerless queen who was finally considered too expensive to retain. The palace, with its age-old knowledge, soaked in this moment just like any other. Within its walls, which had witnessed coronations and abdications, and every human sorrow in between, were stored William's remorse, Camilla's resignation, and Charles's remote anguish. It patiently and eternally preserved these secrets just as it had always done. The only question that mattered was asked by the palace while the rain persisted and the world outside burst into scandal headlines. When a queen who does not possess a throne makes the decision to abdicate, what follows? As she departs, she carries the final sliver of faith that love could ultimately prevail over duty within the heartless realm of a crown. Finally, farewell. It was no secret that Camilla was more capable than most people gave her credit for. She was a strong woman who had overcome obstacles that would have crushed weaker spirits. Hidden beneath her immaculately coiffed hair and exquisite garments and the perfectly rehearsed grins she flashed to the cameras and the onlookers. The public's animosity for her had been relentless, coming in waves that had never stopped. The day had come, in a modest London apartment distant from the opulent mansions she had once inhabited, for her to finally snap. Now the room was practically deserted. She had packed a few suitcases full of her meager possessions, mostly clothing, along with a few of books and photographs that she couldn't bear to part with. Everything else would be gathered and shipped at a later time, or maybe even forgotten about altogether. It has lost most of its significance. She took her time, making her way around the room, gazing at walls that had seen her happiest and saddest moments and touching objects she would never touch again. Without the normal entourage, no security detail to make a show of her departure, and the dignity of a solitary car with a discreet driver, that was her choice. More money had been offered to her. When they wished to alleviate their own feelings of guilt, they would always contribute more. All of it, though, Camilla had turned down. Quietly, she would depart if she were being removed. At least with that, she had some control. On the mantel rested a portrait, and her gaze lingered there. A miniature watercolor of Highrove's gardens, the one spot where I'd always felt at ease. Charles had planted a rose garden for her, and she recalled the day he showed her the plants, his expression exuding a mischievous enthusiasm as he identified each species. As a symbol of grace, a white rose represents a fresh start, while a yellow one represents the sunlight she brought into his otherwise gloomy life. He said, "These are yours," as he held her hand. "You will always have a lovely and secure spot to call home because this entire garden is at your disposal." In that moment, She had trusted him, had hoped that love might create sanctuary even in the harshest of environments. But flowers couldn't hide her from the scrutiny of her past, and gardens couldn't hide her from the past either. An ominous tap jolted her out of her reverie. Charles stood before her as the door swung open. He appeared paler and more delicate than she had ever seen him before. His face was pale, and his eyes crimson from a weariness that went beyond just physical sickness. They just stared across the room at each other for what seemed like an eternity. Then, in a matter of 3 swift steps, he crossed to her side and embraced her. They embraced silently, realizing that no amount of words could express their feelings. He was nervous when he touched her back. She snuggled up to him, her forehead against his shoulder, savoring his aroma as she hoped to commit this sensation to memory. As she felt his tears dripping into her hair, she knew it was time for her own to fall, the one she'd been hoarding for days. He murmured an apology, his voice quivering. She whispered something like, "I know," after which she continued, I tried so hard." As they separated, they looked at each other and said, "I know you did." There was immediate connection. Every vow they had taken, every fight they had fought side by side, and every joy they had snatched from a world hell-bent on denying them were all included in that one look. There was no need for words. They were both aware that this was their last goodbye, that love could no longer satisfy the demands of responsibility. Charles leaned back and tenderly kissed her forehead. He couldn't bear to wait by the window and watch her go, so he bolted out the room without turning around, his steps reverberating down the corridor until they eventually died out. After standing alone for one additional second, Camilla gathered her purse and made her way to the entrance. An engine hummed softly as the royal carriage patiently waited in the downpour. Without making eye contact, the driver unlocked her door, and she gracefully settled into the rear seat. She gazed out at the gloomy streets of London as they drove away from the house, a place that had never truly felt like home to her and a nation that had never fully forgiven her. Heavy and persistent rain persisted, as if the skies were in sorrow over this departure. As Camilla watched the rain pour out the window, she couldn't help but think how fitting it was that the weather appeared to comprehend the impact of loss. Boarding the plane that would whisk her away from it all was her first stop at the airport. Absence of photographers, crowds, and the need to make a concluding statement. A peaceful departure from a life that had never truly belonged to her. Additionally, during the subsequent hush, an additional inquiry lingered like a cloud of smoke. Is there any hope for the future of the royal family's peace? On the other hand, has the crown's price grown too great for anyone to bear? On the throne's destiny, responsibility was like second skin to William. He knew, even as a little boy, that he was a part of a greater whole. When others failed, he would step up and take the reins. He was the heir apparent. He was praised for his stability and beauty. He was praised as the son who never brought shame or scandal upon his family. However, lurking beneath that calm facade resided a guy who experienced the full weight of each decision, tossing and turning in his sleep over past choices and the possibility of alternate outcomes. He walked alone through the Windsor Gardens, where he had first wrestled with his terrible choice, weeks after the announcement. The fall had turned into the first days of winter. In stark contrast to the cloudy sky, the trees stood naked, their limbs extending upward like unanswerable questions. It was as if the palace had let out a long-held breath. The air seemed lighter. Additional controversies had piqued the interest of the media. Support for the monarchy's course has recently surged, according to the polls. Despite the fact that his choice had been right on all counts, he had never felt his heart weigh so heavily. The people witnessed a return to stability. They failed to notice the personal schisms that had split his family apart like ancient glass. He was now barely acknowledged by Charles. They spoke in cold, formalities, only tones that were absolutely essential. William felt like a stranger in his son's clothes as they walked down the hall. Camilla's absence resounded like a heartbeat missing at every royal occasion, and his father seemed to look past him instead of at him. Her vacant seat at black tie affairs, the rescheduled agendas that omitted her patronages, the way, during rituals, Charles's hand would reflexively extend, looking for the one who had departed. As she held his hand in the dim light of their bedroom, trying to reassure him that he was sleeping, Catherine had made an effort. "You did what was necessary," she murmured softly but firmly one night. William was uncertain if the study of history would suffice to alleviate the void within his chest, despite the fact that the crown had ordered it. Unannounced, the letter had reached his private study yesterday. Even without the royal seal or formal letterhead, he could instantly recognize his name scrawled in handwriting. The handwriting of Camilla is distinctively slanted and fluid, like water. Uncertain of what to anticipate, he cautiously opened it. On the contrary, He noticed that the middle of the page included just 3 sentences. Your motivation is clear to me. The crown compels us to do the unthinkable. William, you have my forgiveness. The woman who had loved her father enough to know that duty sometimes required brutality was forgiving him for what they seemed to be. Genuine forgiveness, though he had read those words a dozen times, looking for hidden meanings or hatred. With the letter in one hand, William stood in his study, gazing at the photograph on his desk. It showed his mother Diana smiling at the camera with that radiant warmth that had captivated the world. Resting Camilla's letter delicately beside it, he created an improbable match that seemed somehow appropriate. 2 ladies who had played radically different roles in shaping his fate. God, the source of his life and the source of his compassion. Someone else who had demonstrated to him that love could endure despite the world's disapproval. They were both now merely intangible, existing only in their memories. The victims of the king's insatiable desire for blood sacrifice. The endless, dismal horizon was seen through the window. William mumbled something to himself, the vacant room, and the spirits of decisions that could never be reversed. We will see the monarchy through. However, he was fully aware of the truth even as he spoke those words. The institution would, indeed, last. The throne would be passed down through the ages in this manner. With unrelenting efficiency, the royal machinery would keep on turning. However, he would never be able to escape the expense, the horrible personal cost. For all the solemn occasions when his dad stood alone, whenever there is a pause after laughing, he knew he had protected the crown at the cost of his loved one's emotions. Where responsibility meets grief and history meets the present, in the quiet core of Windsor. Not the power he will inherit, but the price he paid to protect it haunts the future king as he wanders alone through lonely gardens.